A rich man and a young waitress are forced to pretend they're married for a day and end up falling in love. Before we start, comment below and tell us which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Helena worked as a waitress at a fancy party. She was tired from walking back and forth. She knew she couldn't stop for even a second because the money she earned there was essential to support her family. Meanwhile, Eduardo Vasconcelos, an important millionaire, walked through the hall as if he owned the place. Eduardo was used to being the center of attention. That night he was annoyed. He thought that parties like that were just for show. He knew that his presence was expected. He felt like he was wasting time. He had already greeted the right people, exchanged polite smiles, listened to stories that didn't interest him. All he wanted now was to leave. As Eduardo wandered down a corridor, not paying attention, Helena came from the other direction, carrying a tray of appetizers. She didn't notice Eduardo. They collided. The glass of whiskey Eduardo was holding spilled on his shirt from the impact. Helena took a step back, startled. As the tray Eduardo saw that the wine glass had fallen from Helena's hands. It broke into pieces, which scattered across the floor. "What the hell?" Eduardo exclaimed, glaring at the mess. Helena stammered, trying to apologize. Before she could form coherent words, they heard footsteps approaching from the hall. "Someone's coming," Eduardo murmured. Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room, confused, before turning to Eduardo, who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone more exasperated than intended. "Avoiding more trouble," he replied curtly. Outside, footsteps grew louder. Voices followed. "What the hell?" Eduardo exclaimed, glaring at the mess. "I'm sorry," Helena stammered, trying to apologize. Before she could form coherent words, they heard footsteps approaching from the hall. "Someone's coming," Eduardo murmured to himself. More than to her. As he grabbed Helena by the arm and led her to the nearest door. With no time to think, Helena let herself be guided. Eduardo opened a side door leading to a small room, probably meant for guests. He gently pushed her inside and shut the door behind them. In the silence that followed, Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room, confused, before turning to Eduardo, who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone more exasperated than intended. "Avoiding more trouble," he replied curtly. Outside, the footsteps grew louder. Voices followed. Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room, confused, before turning to Eduardo, who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone more exasperated than intended. "Avoiding more trouble," he replied curtly. Outside, the footsteps grew louder. Voices followed, commenting on the noise. Helena's heart raced. Being alone in a room with one of the most important guests at the party was the last thing she wanted. When the footsteps faded and silence returned, Helena sighed in relief. But the feeling didn't last long. She realized how easily their situation could change. Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room, confused, before turning to Eduardo, who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone more exasperated than intended. Avoiding more trouble, he replied curtly. Outside. Footsteps grew louder. Voices followed. Misunderstood if anyone found them there. Eduardo seemed to realize the same thing. He rubbed his face with one hand. Visibly frustrated. Great. Just what I needed. He muttered more to himself than to her. Helena was about to leave when the door suddenly opened. A woman in a long dress with a curious expression appeared. Followed by a man holding a camera. What's going on here? The woman asked. A sly smile spreading across her face. Helena's stomach churned. Eduardo. Quick as always. Stepped in front of her and raised a hand to block the camera. This is none of your business, he said firmly. But the damage? Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room. Confused. Before turning to Eduardo. Who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. What are you doing? She asked. Her tone more exasperated than intended. Avoiding more trouble, he replied curtly. Outside. The footsteps grew louder. Voices followed. Was done. Within minutes. The incident became the talk of the party. Murmurs filled the room. Judgmental looks followed Helena whenever she tried to resume her work. Eduardo, however, seemed unfazed. While Helena struggled to keep her composure. He moved through the hall as if nothing had happened. Although his eyes occasionally sought hers. When the party ended, Helena hurried out with a heavy heart. She knew her fragile reputation in that environment was at risk. It didn't matter what really happened. Those people. The story was already told. She was the unwanted protagonist. That night. As Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room. Confused. Before turning to Eduardo. Who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. What are you doing? She asked. Her tone more exasperated than intended. Avoiding more trouble, he replied curtly. Outside. Footsteps grew louder. Voices followed. She walked home under the dark sky. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was on the horizon. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about Eduardo. He seemed so unattainable. Unexpectedly close. Him. The night had also left a mark. The first time in a long while. Eduardo felt something slipping out of his control. That unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. The morning after the party began in chaos. Eduardo woke up to several missed calls and messages. He already knew what they were about before even reading them. The confusion from the previous night still lingered. Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room. Confused. Before turning to Eduardo. Who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. What are you doing? She asked. Her tone more exasperated than intended. Avoiding more trouble, he replied curtly. Outside. Footsteps grew louder. Voices followed. Night had started to gain momentum. Rumors circulated among the party's guests. Some gossip sites were already vaguely mentioning an unexpected romance involving the Vasconcelos heir. Meanwhile, Helena tried to return to her routine. Yet every time she remembered the incident, a wave of anxiety washed over her. Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room. Confused. Before turning to Eduardo. Who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. What are you doing? She asked. Her tone more exasperated than intended. Avoiding more trouble, he replied curtly. Outside. Footsteps grew louder. Voices followed. She was certain her presence at work that day wouldn't be welcome. Quitting her job wasn't an option. She needed it. No matter how difficult it was to endure the judgmental stares. However, the unfolding events turned out to be more unexpected than either of them could have predicted. Alas, Helena tried to catch her breath. She looked around the room. Confused. Before turning to Eduardo, who seemed as irritated as he was unsettled. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her tone more exasperated than intended. "Avoiding more trouble," he replied curtly. Outside. Footsteps grew louder. Followed by voices. A short phone call summoned Helena back to the mansion. She arrived confused. Her mind racing with thoughts. Unaware of what awaited her. Eduardo was waiting for her in the living room. Standing next to an imposing table. He looked serious. Almost somber. He got straight to the point. "We need to talk." The conversation, though brief, revealed something unsettling. One of the guests at the party was an important investor for Eduardo's business. This investor was very honest and reliable. He had heard the rumor about Eduardo being in a relationship. Surprisingly, seemed more willing to close a big deal with someone who had family responsibilities. For Eduardo, the scandal wasn't just a threat to his reputation, it was a threat to his business. The solution Eduardo proposed to Helena was strange. It made sense to him that he suggested they pretend to be married. At least until he could complete the deal with the investor. Helena didn't like the idea. She couldn't understand how it could possibly work. Eduardo, with his persuasive nature, insisted that he explained it would only be for a day. No one would believe it. That it was the only way to keep the previous situation secret. Night's incident from escalating further. Helena hesitated. The fear of losing her job and further damaging her reputation made her agree to it. Eduardo promised everything would be controlled with no room for mistakes. The plan seemed simple. Quickly proved to be far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The next day, Eduardo and Helena arrived at the event together. Walking side by side. The night's incident caused things to get worse. Helena hesitated. She was afraid of losing her job and hurting her reputation more. She agreed. Eduardo promised everything would be under control and that nothing would go wrong. The plan seemed simple. It turned out to be much more complicated than either of them had expected. The next day, Eduardo and Helena arrived at the event together. Walking side by side. He was perfect. As always. Helena, wearing a simple but elegant dress that was hastily arranged, looked nervous but confident. All eyes immediately turned to them. Whispers spread across the room. Surprisingly, the comments were positive. Eduardo, used to the attention, tried to stay calm. Meanwhile, Helena felt every gaze like a blade cutting through her skin. Soon, the investor in question, a middle by the side. He was perfect as always. Helena, wearing a simple but elegant dress that she had quickly put on, looked nervous but confident. All eyes immediately turned to them. Whispers spread across the room. Surprisingly, the comments were positive. Eduardo, used to the attention, tried to stay calm. Meanwhile, Helena felt every gaze like a blade cutting through her skin. Soon, the investor in question, a middle-aged man named Carlos Montero, approached them. He seemed pleased to see Eduardo with her and quickly began asking questions about Helena. To Eduardo's surprise, Helena responded with unexpected ease. With a shy but genuine smile, she shared details about their relationship, inventing small stories about how they met and what they enjoyed about each other's company. Carlos appeared charmed. He complimented Helena several times, mentioning how a man named Carlos Montero approached them. He seemed pleased to see Eduardo with Helena. Quickly started asking questions about her. To Eduardo's surprise, Helena responded with ease. With a shy but genuine smile, she shared details about their relationship, inventing small stories about how they met and what they enjoyed about each other's company. Carlos appeared charmed. He complimented Helena several times, mentioning how she seemed to bring a more human and relatable side to Eduardo. What was supposed to be a brief interaction stretched on for almost an hour. Eduardo began to notice the attention shifting away from him and toward Helena. The guests, who typically surrounded him, were now captivated by her authenticity. While he answered superficial questions, Helena was being asked about her impressions of life with Eduardo. He must be difficult at times, right? Someone asked, with a sparkle in her eyes. Helena replied without hesitation that he's demanding. Yes. He also has a side few people get to see. Eduardo nearly choked on his champagne upon hearing that. Maintained a neutral expression that he knew any misstep could expose their lie. The most uncomfortable moment of the night came when one of the guests suggested a toast to the couple. Eduardo had to improvise a short speech, while Helena tried to mask her nervousness with a polite smile. As the hours went by, Eduardo began noticing something that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Helena was winning people over with her simplicity and sincerity. The very traits he usually dismissed now seemed to make him the second most interesting person at the event. On the other hand, Helena felt trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. Now had to perform flawlessly. Every smile, every word, was carefully. An older man named Carlos Montero approached them. He seemed happy to see Eduardo with Helena. Quickly started asking questions about her. To Eduardo's surprise, Helena responded with ease. With a shy but genuine smile, she shared details about their relationship, making up small stories about how they met and what they enjoyed about each other's company. Carlos appeared charmed. He complimented Helena several times, mentioning how it was a lie that kept them safe. When the night finally ended, Eduardo and Helena returned to the mansion together. The silence in the car was heavy, as neither of them knew how to process what had happened. Once they arrived, Eduardo was the first to speak. He thanked Helena, something rare for him. Though his words were brief, there was a tone of sincerity that surprised her. Exhausted, Helena simply nodded before leaving. She walked away. She couldn't help but think about how drastically her life had changed in such a short time. Eduardo, meanwhile, stood still for a moment. He knew this couldn't last. He couldn't deny that there was something about Helena that unsettled him in ways he couldn't understand. What had started as a practical solution now seemed to open a door that both of them feared crossing. The next day began with an uneasy silence. Helena woke up. A man named Carlos Montero approached them. He seemed pleased to see Eduardo with her and quickly started asking questions about Helena. To Eduardo's surprise, Helena responded with ease. With a shy but genuine smile, she shared details about their relationship, making up small stories about how they met and what they enjoyed about each other's company. Carlos appeared charmed. He complimented Helena several times, mentioning how she stared out the window of the small room assigned to her in the mansion, trying to organize her thoughts. The events of the previous night felt like a blur. The curious looks and insinuating comments from the guests still echoed in her mind. It all felt surreal. She, who had always lived on the margins of a world filled with luxury and excess, now found herself at the center of it. Even in a completely artificial, a man named Carlos Montero approached them. He seemed pleased to see Eduardo. Quickly began asking questions about Helena. To Eduardo's surprise, Helena responded with ease. With a shy but genuine smile, she shared details about their relationship, inventing small stories about how they met and what they enjoyed about each other's company. Carlos appeared charmed. He complimented Helena several times, mentioning how. Meanwhile, on the other side of the house, Eduardo was also restless. Despite being a man used to controlling every detail around him, he felt as if the previous day had slipped from his grasp. The success of their lie hadn't been due to his charisma or influence, to Helena's spontaneity and authenticity. This bothered him more than he cared to admit. The morning passed with an odd sense of normalcy. Helena busied herself with simple tasks. He stayed away from Eduardo while he was still in his office. The calm didn't last long. By the afternoon, Eduardo had an unexpected visitor, Carlos Montero, the investor who was fascinated by Eduardo's wife. Carlos came to the mansion with a stack of documents and a new business proposal. He stayed away from Eduardo while he was still in his office. This didn't last long. By the afternoon, Eduardo had an unexpected visitor, Carlos Montero, the investor who was fascinated by Eduardo's wife. Carlos came to the mansion with a stack of documents and a new business idea. With his big personality, Carlos insisted that Helena join the conversation. To him, she was the key to understanding Eduardo better. Eduardo didn't want to. He called Helena in. When she came into the room, she looked clearly nervous. Carlos greeted her warmly, praised her behavior at the party, asked personal questions that Eduardo would never have. Carlos invited Helena to join the conversation. He wanted her help to better understand Eduardo. Eduardo was reluctant to invite her. When she came into the room, she looked nervous. Carlos greeted her warmly. He praised her behavior at the party and asked personal questions that Eduardo would never have dared to ask. Helena responded cautiously, carefully choosing her words. As Carlos spoke about his expectations for the partnership, Helena discreetly observed the environment around her. Eduardo's office was imposing. It carried an unexplainable weight. Every detail seemed meticulously chosen. The space lacked warmth and personality. While Carlos continued talking, Helena allowed herself to glance at the documents he had brought. It wasn't her intention to pry. Something in the papers caught her attention. There were mentions of a property that seemed familiar. At the top of a contract was the name of a company, Andrade and Sons. Her heart raced. Helena recognized the name. It was her family's company. The one that had gone bankrupt years ago, leaving behind a trail of debts and frustration. Unintentionally, she let out an audible sigh, which caught Eduardo's attention. He looked at her with a mix of curiosity and concern. Said nothing. The moment after Carlos finally left, satisfied with the outcome of the discussion, Eduardo confronted Helena. You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem? Hesitant, Helena decided not to mention what she had seen. She didn't know if she could trust Eduardo. The last thing she wanted was to reveal I was just nervous, I'm not used to this kind of situation. Eduardo didn't press further. Something about her response left him uneasy. He was used to reading people. There was something about her that didn't quite add up later. As she walked through the garden, Helena tried to process what she had seen. After Carlos left, Eduardo confronted Helena. You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem? Helena hesitated. She didn't know if she could trust Eduardo. She didn't want to reveal what she had seen. She knew her family's company had been taken over by someone else years ago. She had never known who. Now everything was starting to make sense. At the same time, Eduardo found himself grappling with a different question. Out of boredom and curiosity, he decided to. After Carlos left, Eduardo confronted Helena. You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem? Helena wasn't sure if she could trust Eduardo. She didn't want to reveal her investigation. With his access, Eduardo quickly found basic information about her. What he discovered left him unsettled. Helena was the primary provider for her family. She supported her alien mother and a younger brother still in school. She worked 2 jobs and still lived with the bare minimum. Eduardo had never concerned himself with financial struggles. Something about Helena's story touched him. He began to see her in a different light, recognizing the strength behind her apparent simplicity. As the day progressed, they started seeing each other from new perspectives. Eduardo, who had always believed that success comes from strength and ambition, now he saw in Helena a determination that had nothing to do with her status or wealth. On the other hand, Helena, though still wary of Eduardo's intentions, began to notice that he wasn't just the arrogant and cold man she had imagined. However, the weight of their discoveries lingered between them. The moment after Carlos finally left, happy with how the meeting went, Eduardo spoke to Helena. You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem? Helena hesitated. She wasn't sure if she could trust Eduardo. She didn't want to reveal her secrets to him. I need to learn more about the connection between Eduardo and my family's problems, Helena thought. But I can't act impulsively. Eduardo couldn't stop wondering how someone so different from him could be so curious about him. When night fell, both were. After Carlos left, Eduardo confronted Helena. You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem? He asked. Helena decided not to mention what she had seen. She didn't know if she could trust Eduardo. The last thing she wanted was to reveal her exhaustion. Exhausted, neither could sleep. With her mind full of unanswered questions, Helena decided to take a walk around the mansion. During her stroll, she discovered a hallway she hadn't noticed before. The walls were adorned with family portraits. One in particular caught her attention. It was Eduardo, much younger, standing. She didn't know if she could trust Eduardo. The last thing she wanted was to reveal her, beside an older man who seemed to be his father. As she looked at the face in the portrait, Helena felt a pang of recognition. There was something familiar about the man. She couldn't pinpoint what it was. Back in her room, Helena tried to piece things together, whatever was happening. It was clear their lives were more. The moment after Carlos left, Eduardo confronted Helena. You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem? Helena hesitated. She didn't know if she could trust Eduardo. She didn't want to reveal her feelings for him. They were closer than they thought. The next morning was tense. Since seeing that portrait the night before, Helena felt like she was walking a tightrope, ready to fall at any moment. The image of Eduardo's after Carlos left. Eduardo confronted Helena. You seemed uncomfortable during the meeting. Is there a problem? Helena hesitated. She didn't know if she could trust Eduardo. She didn't want to reveal her father, who was a vague but unsettling reminder of something buried in her past. It wasn't just a face in a frame, it was a symbol of the pain her family had carried for years. On the other hand, Eduardo was equally restless. He was still reflecting on the information he had uncovered about Helena and trying to ignore the growing discomfort. Whenever he thought about her, he felt a certain way. They talked briefly that morning. Helena nodded at him and stayed away. He said something quiet in return. They were both too focused on what they were doing to notice the looks they gave each other. The tension between them grew unbearable. As the day went on, Eduardo tried to stay calm. He felt irritated. He felt like Helena was avoiding him. He didn't understand why. Meanwhile, Helena was determined to stay professional. She worked hard on any task that as the day went on. Eduardo tried to stay calm. He felt annoyed by how Helena seemed to be avoiding him. There was something different about her. Something he couldn't figure out. Meanwhile, Helena was determined to stay professional and focused on her tasks. She couldn't stop thinking about the questions that came up. The breaking point came during lunch. Eduardo was frustrated by Helena's insistence on being formal. He made a sarcastic remark about her ability to disappear whenever he was nearby. He made her angry. As the day went on, they started to interact in a more natural way. Eduardo laughed at something for the first time in years. During lunch, Eduardo made a sarcastic remark about her ability to disappear whenever he was nearby. His words were full of disdain. This hit Helena hard. She paused for a moment, looking directly at him, before delivering a sharp retort. What followed was an intense argument. But, ironically, it carried a hint of comedic relief. With her straightforward personality, Helena didn't hesitate to point out Eduardo's flaws. He was used to always having. He was used to always being right. Now he felt like she was being brutally honest. Beneath the insults, there was a different kind of energy. Something both of them recognized but weren't ready to admit. As the day went on, the arguments gave way to a more natural interaction. Eduardo, the first time in years, found himself laughing at something. It wasn't related to business or appearances. Helena, though still cautious, began to see more like Eduardo than his arrogant exterior during a break in the garden. A rare moment of silence enveloped them. Helena focused on the flowers, avoiding looking at Eduardo directly. He sat on a nearby bench, lost in thought that it was a rare. This was a moment of peace between them. It carried an unspoken depth. The silence was finally broken by Eduardo, who hesitantly began talking about his relationship with his father. He didn't go into detail. His words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Helena listened carefully, trying to conceal the storm of emotions she felt as she heard the name of that man. As Eduardo spoke, Helena realized he wasn't as different from her as she had thought. He carried scars, too, though they were of a completely different nature. This made her question her own prejudices. Also deepened her confusion. How could she even begin to trust someone who it was tied to her family's downfall? In the days that followed, their relationship changed. They shared humorous arguments. Something else was growing between them: closeness. Eduardo, who always avoided discussing his past, began to trust Helena more, despite her resistance. Helena saw a side of Eduardo that few people ever saw, however. The secrets hanging over them threatened to destroy everything they were building. Helena knew she needed to confront Eduardo about his family's involvement in. The tension between them had been growing for some time. On a rainy evening, it reached a breaking point. Helena decided it was time to confront Eduardo. She found him in his office. Seated. He was sitting in his usual chair, staring at a glass of whiskey, as if it held the answers he sought. She entered without knocking. She was determined, though her courage faltered when she looked at him. There was something in his eyes that made her feel vulnerable and defiant. Without saying anything, Helena began to speak. Her words were firm. There was sadness in it. Eduardo couldn't ignore it. She told him what she had discovered about her family's company and how it all seemed to connect to him. Eduardo listened in silence, his face unreadable. His eyes showed the internal battle he was fighting. When she finished, the silence that followed was deafening. Eduardo stood and walked to the window. A moment. It seemed like he wouldn't respond. Then he spoke in a calm, controlled voice. He didn't deny that his family was involved. Did he apologize? Instead, he explained what had happened and the circumstances that had led to the merger that ruined Helena's family. His words didn't justify his actions. They offered a different perspective. Helena listened, feeling many emotions, including anger, sadness, and, to her surprise, a touch of understanding. She didn't know what to think or feel. She only knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. That night marked a turning point for both of them. The masks they had worn began to fall, revealing who they truly were. Although there was still a long road ahead, something had shifted. Something that, despite all the secrets and conflicts, connected them in a way neither could ignore. The next morning brought an unusual stillness to the mansion. The air felt heavy with tension, as if even the walls knew that something was about to happen. Helena had spent the night awake, unable to stop thinking. Every time she closed her eyes, she was reminded of the confrontation with Eduardo, the revelations about the past. Most of all, the growing sense that something was wrong. The air felt heavy with tension. Even the walls seemed to know that something was about to happen. Helena had spent the night awake, unable to stop thinking. Every time she closed her eyes, she was reminded of the confrontation with Eduardo, the revelations about the past, and, most of all, the growing sense that she was caught up in something much bigger than she could control. Eduardo, too, found himself restless in a way he hadn't been for years. He had spent the night pacing in his office, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey sitting on his desk. The thought of continuing to lie felt unbearable. The idea of exposing she was caught up in something much bigger than she could control. Eduardo also felt restless. He hadn't felt this way for years. He spent the night pacing in his office, staring at the glass of whiskey on his desk. He couldn't bear to continue lying. He was also terrified of facing the consequences. Eduardo was used to controlling situations. Now he felt completely helpless. Let's play a game with the people who only read the comments. Type pizza in the comments. Only those who make it this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story. Throughout the day, Helena and Eduardo had brief encounters in the mansion, marked by meaningful glances and unspoken words. They knew a decision had to be made. Neither was ready to face the other again. The tension was almost palpable. Meanwhile, the outside world continued moving forward. Unaware of their internal struggle, rumors about the perfect couple began to spread among the event's guests. Helena, with her natural charm, had won the admiration of many, while Eduardo was surprised by how many people now viewed him differently thanks to his wife. Yet, the more their lies became solidified, the heavier the burden became for both of them. Rumors about the perfect couple began to spread among the event's guests. Helena was charming. Many admired her. Eduardo was surprised that so many people now saw him differently because of his wife. The more their lies grew, the harder it was for both of them. In the early afternoon, an unexpected phone call made the situation even more complicated. One of Eduardo's key investors, a man known for his exactness and mistrust, announced that he wanted a private dinner with the couple that evening. Eduardo knew that refusing would be seen as a sign of weakness or dishonesty. He knew that he couldn't refuse the investor's dinner invitation. Even though he didn't want to. He told Helena about the dinner shortly afterward. They didn't talk for long. They both knew that they had to go through with it. Helena felt uncomfortable. She knew that she had no other choice. Still, she felt almost unbearable at the thought of spending another evening putting on a show for the investors. The dinner was at a fancy restaurant that made the guests feel important. The investor and his wife, a smart and elegant woman, listened closely to everything that Eduardo and Helena said. Despite the tension, Helena did well. In the early afternoon, Eduardo got an unexpected phone call. One of his investors, a man known for his meticulousness and mistrust, said he wanted to have a private dinner with the couple that evening. Eduardo knew that refusing would be seen as a sign of weakness or dishonesty. Herself surprisingly well, using her intelligence and charm to deflect difficult questions and smooth over awkward moments. Eduardo, observing her, felt a mix of pride and discomfort. He knew he was asking more of Helena than was fair. It deeply unsettled him. The parade nearly collapsed when the investor's wife asked. An unexpected phone call made the situation more complicated. One of Eduardo's key investors, a man known for his meticulousness and mistrust, announced that he wanted a private dinner with the couple that evening. Eduardo knew that refusing would be seen as a sign of weakness or dishonesty. The question seemed innocent but was actually loaded. How did you two meet? The silence that followed felt endless. Eduardo tried to answer. The words escaped him. It was Helena who, with remarkable quick thinking, crafted a convincing story about a chance meeting at an art gallery, adding just enough detail to make it believable. The couple seemed satisfied. Eduardo could see how much the lie was wearing them down when the dinner finally ended. Both of them were exhausted, not just from the effort of sustaining the lie, from the growing realization that this couldn't continue. On the way back to the mansion, the silence between them was unlike in the early afternoon. Eduardo got a call from one of his investors. This investor was known for being very particular and always doubting people. He said he wanted to have a private dinner with Eduardo and his wife that evening. Eduardo knew that saying no would make him look weak or dishonest. Eduardo and his wife had had many difficult moments together. They were angry and frustrated. They couldn't ignore the weight of this situation. Eduardo was the first to speak. His voice was low and emotional. He said that he couldn't continue like this. He said that for the first time in years, he felt like he needed to do something. In the early afternoon, Eduardo got a surprising phone call. One of his important investors said he wanted to have a private dinner with Eduardo and Helena that evening. Eduardo knew that refusing would make him look weak or dishonest. Even if he lost everything. Helena listened in silence. Her expression neutral. Her eyes showed the inner conflict within her. When the investor finished speaking, it was Helena's turn. Her voice trembled slightly as she admitted that she, too, was tired of lying. She was afraid of the consequences. Eduardo represented everything she had always despised: privilege, arrogance, power. Yet, at the same time, she was beginning to see something deeper in him. Something that confused her. The final decision came as a silent agreement between the two of them. The next morning, they would reveal the truth. No matter what the consequences were. They spent in the early afternoon. An unexpected phone call made the situation even more complicated. One of Eduardo's key investors, a man known for his meticulousness and mistrust, announced that he wanted a private dinner with the couple that evening. Eduardo knew that refusing would be seen as a sign of weakness or dishonesty. The rest of the night, the couple reflected on what they had built or perhaps destroyed together in their respective rooms. When the sun finally rose, casting new light over the mansion, Eduardo and Helena were ready to face the world. Though they didn't know what the future held, there was an unspoken certainty between them. An unexpected phone call made the situation more complicated. One of Eduardo's key investors, a man known for his meticulousness and mistrust, announced that he wanted a private dinner with the couple that evening. Eduardo knew that refusing would be seen as a sign of weakness or dishonesty. Even though it had all started with a lie, what they had shared was real. That gave them the courage to face whatever came next. The new day arrived. The atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty and tension. Helena and Eduardo woke earlier than usual. Each lost in their own thoughts. It was time to reveal the truth. Now the weight of that decision felt even heavier. The morning light made everything seem more obvious. Helena went down to the kitchen in search of a strong cup of coffee to ease the anxiety in her stomach. Meanwhile, Eduardo remained in his office, staring out the window with a distant gaze. He knew that confessing the lie would risk his reputation and his relationship with Helena, which already seemed on the verge of collapse. When they finally met in the living room, neither spoke immediately. Helena gripped her coffee cup tightly, as if it were an anchor, while Eduardo seemed to struggle to find the right words. The silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was full of expectation and fear. Finally, Eduardo spoke. His voice was low and hesitant. He explained how they would approach the guests and investors. His plan was simple. Risky. He admitted the mistake. He took full responsibility. He tried to salvage whatever they could. He assured Helena that she had nothing to lose. He said that all the blame would be his. Helena listened intently. Something inside her felt unsettled. It wasn't just fear of what might happen. It was also the sense that, over their time together, something genuine had developed between them. Though everything had started with a lie, she couldn't ignore the moments when Eduardo had shown vulnerability, care, even unexpected kindness. The first test came shortly after breakfast. When one of Eduardo's assistants arrived with a list of investors expecting a meeting that afternoon, Eduardo knew he had to be there. He had to be honest. He was nervous. Helena noticed how anxious he was and placed her hand on his shoulder. This simple gesture meant, "You can do this." Her voice was steady, even though she was nervous when the moment arrived. Eduardo and Helena stood together in front of a small group of important people in the mansion's main hall. Eduardo began to speak. His posture stiff. His voice full of true feeling that he admitted to lying about his relationship with Helena. Explaining that the situation had quickly become out of control. Eduardo and Helena stood together in front of a small group of important people in the mansion's main hall. Eduardo began to speak. His posture stiff. His voice filled with sincere emotion. He admitted to lying about his relationship with Helena. Explaining that the situation had quickly become out of control and that, in a moment of desperation, he had made poor decisions. As Eduardo spoke, Helena felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Some faces showed surprise. Others disbelief. What affected her most was realizing that Eduardo was taking all the blame. He made it clear that Helena had no choice in the matter. That she had simply helped him. In a time of need when he finished. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. It seemed as though everyone was processing Eduardo's words. One of the senior investors, a man with a stern expression and an authoritative tone, was the first to break the silence. He asked direct questions. Probing the reasons behind the lie and its potential impact on the business, Eduardo responded with honesty. Admitting that he had risked everything but affirming his willingness to face the consequences, Helena watched silently. Torn. On one hand, she admired Eduardo's courage in owning his mistakes. On the other, she felt that he was still trying to shield her. Even Eduardo spoke to a small group of important people in the mansion's main hall. He was standing with his back straight. His voice was full of emotion. He said he lied about his relationship with Helena. He explained that the situation had quickly gotten out of control and that he had to sacrifice more of himself. After hours of talking and confronting each other, they were finally alone. The tension in the room was almost too much to bear. Eduardo looked tired. His shoulders were down, as if he was carrying the weight of the world. Helena, who hadn't said anything until then, felt like she had to. Eduardo stood with a group of important people in the mansion's main hall. He started to speak. Looking serious but also sad. He said he lied about his relationship with Helena. He explained that it got out of control quickly. He didn't have to do that alone. You didn't have to take it all on yourself, she said. Her voice calm but also sad. Eduardo looked up, surprised by what she said. He didn't respond right away. His eyes showed that he was thankful and sorry. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Many of the investors. Eduardo stood with a group of important people in the mansion's main hall. He started to speak. Looking serious but also emotional. He told them he had lied about his relationship with Helena. He said the situation had quickly gotten out of control. He chose to keep working with her. Some people were impressed by his honesty and decided to stay friends with him. Others decided to end their friendship because they didn't trust someone who had lied. Eduardo felt sad about losing these friendships. He knew he couldn't continue living in a way that wasn't real. Helena decided to stay at the mansion for a few more days to help Eduardo deal with what had happened. During that time, the two of them started to share more honest moments. They weren't pretending anymore. Their relationship started to change. It wasn't based on distrust or lies anymore. It was based on something more real. But there was still a lot to deal with. Eduardo and Helena were at a meeting in the mansion. Eduardo was nervous. He told the group that he had lied about his relationship with Helena. He said that he had started to doubt his feelings for her and whether he could trust her. Eduardo also had his own problems. He was trying to prove to himself that he could be someone better. They didn't know what would happen in the future. They were going to be together. They wanted to be a real couple that could last. Even though they had started with a lie. The days that followed were hard for Eduardo and Helena. They felt confused and upset. They were also hopeful. The two were attracted to each other. As time went on, Eduardo learned more and more about Helena. He was surprised by how direct and strong she was. Also how gentle. She was also honest in everything she said and did. Helena, on the other hand, continued. Eduardo and Helena were attracted to each other. Over time, Eduardo learned more and more about Helena. He saw that she was direct, strong, delicate. She was also genuine. Helena, on the other hand, continued to have strong emotions. Eduardo was no longer just the distant millionaire she had judged at first. He was proving to be human and vulnerable. This touched her in ways she didn't know how to process. Even as her heart wavered, Helena remained cautious. After all, Eduardo still embodied. Helena was overwhelmed with emotions. She didn't know how to process everything she was feeling. She had judged Eduardo at first because of his wealth. She was starting to see that he was a human being with his own vulnerabilities. She was cautious because she didn't trust him completely. One afternoon, Eduardo was in the library, reviewing documents that required his attention. His mind was elsewhere. Since he had lied, he felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. When Helena entered the room carrying a tray of tea, Eduardo felt the tightening in his chest again. She placed the tray on the table without saying a word and turned to leave. Eduardo called out to her, "Helena, can you wait a moment?" She stopped and turned, her eyes filled with curiosity. "Eduardo," I watched her as her hair fell in soft waves around her face. Her eyes showed both exhaustion and determination. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. Not just for what you did that day. For being by my side since then." Helena didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply nodded, trying to process. He watched her, seeing how her hair fell in soft waves around her face. How her eyes carried both exhaustion and determination. "I just wanted to thank you for everything," he said. "Not just for what you did that day. For being by my side since then." Helena didn't respond immediately. Instead, she simply nodded, trying to process his words. Eduardo wasn't often this open. It left her feeling unsettled. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet tranquility. Something had shifted. Eduardo felt Helena's presence in a way that seemed to fill the empty spaces in his life. It was as if she were the only person who truly saw beyond the layers. Eduardo wasn't often this open. It left her feeling worried. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully. Something had changed. Eduardo felt Helena's presence in a way that seemed to fill the empty spaces in his life. It was as if she were the only person who truly saw beyond the layers he had built over the years. Later, as they walked through the garden, the autumn air seemed to bring them closer. Leaves were beginning to fall, creating a golden carpet along the path. Without thinking, Eduardo extended his hand to help Helena down a small incline. When their fingers touched, an unexpected warmth surged through them both. Through him. He quickly let go, as though he had made a mistake. That the touch lingered in his mind. It was a simple, almost imperceptible gesture. For Eduardo, it was a reminder that something within him was changing. As they continued walking, Helena began talking about her childhood and how her mother used to say, "What's?" Eduardo wasn't often this open. It left Helena feeling unsettled. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully. Something had changed. Eduardo felt Helena's presence in a way that seemed to fill the empty spaces in his life. It was as if she were the only person who truly saw beyond the layers. True will always stand the test of time. Eduardo listened intently, noticing how her voice softened when she spoke about things she loved. He felt an unknown urge to know her better, to understand what made her eyes light up like that. In the days that followed, Eduardo found ways to be closer to Helena. Even if he wouldn't admit it to himself, that he spent more time in the common areas of the mansion, where he knew she would be. He began asking her questions, listening to her stories, offering help with small tasks for Helena. Eduardo's growing closeness was both intriguing and unsettling. There was something about his gestures, about he seemed to pay close attention to her every word, making her feel special, but there was also the shadow of his past. The secrets he still didn't fully understand. That kept her from fully embracing this new feeling. One rainy evening, they found themselves together in the living room, where Eduardo had lit a fireplace. Helena was reading a book. Eduardo was seated on the opposite couch, pretending to work on his laptop. But in truth, he couldn't take his eyes off her. He noticed things he hadn't before, how she scrunched her nose slightly when she was focused, how her posture relaxed when she was immersed in reading. Without meaning. Eduardo wasn't often this open. It left her feeling worried. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully. Something had changed. Eduardo felt Helena's presence in a way that seemed to fill the empty spaces in his life. It was as if she were the only person who truly saw beyond the layers. Eduardo began imagining what it would be like to have Helena by his side. Not as part of a parade. As something real. Yet, he knew that before that could happen, he had to face his own problems. The secrets he kept. The choices he had made in the past. All of it stood as a barrier between them. And above all, he felt like he needed to prove to Helena and to himself that he could be the man she deserved. That same night, as he stood outside his bedroom door, Eduardo found himself paralyzed by everything he wanted to say to Helena. Didn't know how, that he knew time was slipping away. That if he didn't act soon, he might lose the only chance he had. He was open about his feelings. Helena felt uneasy. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully. Something had changed. Eduardo felt Helena's presence. It made him feel complete. He had to turn this feeling into something real. In her room, Helena was also restless. She couldn't understand why her heart beat faster when she thought of Eduardo. She also couldn't understand why she missed him when they were in different rooms. Despite her doubts, she felt something growing inside her. Eduardo was changing. Maybe, just maybe, she could let him into her heart. The weeks that followed brought even more intense moments. Eduardo found small ways to show his interest. Like leaving a flower on the coffee table. Giving a quiet compliment about her care for the garden. Looking at her for longer than usual. Helena. These gestures were hard to ignore. She began to see that Eduardo wasn't just the complicated man she had met at the start. He was someone trying to be better. Someone who made her question her own beliefs about trust, love, redemption. Their connection grew. Quiet but obvious. There was still much to resolve. One thing was clear, what had begun as she began to see that Eduardo wasn't just a complicated man. He was someone trying to be better. He made her question her own beliefs about trust, love, redemption. Their connection grew quiet but inevitable. There was still much to resolve. One thing was clear, what had begun as a lie now had the potential to become something truly real. The weeks brought an unsettling calm. Like the silence before a storm. Helena and Eduardo continued to share the same spaces. The same days. Slowly their lives intertwined. Almost naturally. Both knew there were unresolved issues hanging in the air. Like shadows. Lie's potential to become real was obvious. The weeks brought an unsettling calm. Like the silence before a storm. Helena and Eduardo continued to share the same spaces. The same days. Slowly their lives intertwined. Almost naturally. Both knew there were unresolved issues hanging in the air. Like shadows. Neither of them wanted to confront the issues. Eduardo watched Helena more than he cared to admit. He found himself captivated by the small details that made her who she was, the way she adjusted her hair when focused. How her eyes sparkled. When she spoke about something she was passionate about. It was impossible for him to ignore. Eduardo found Helena increasingly attractive. He was captivated by the small details that made her who she was. He couldn't ignore how essential she had become to his routine. He had no idea that he was putting the pieces of a puzzle together. On the other hand, Helena was confused about her feelings. Eduardo was no longer just the arrogant millionaire she had met that fateful night at the party. He was thoughtful. He was showing a different side of himself. Even so, Helena reminded herself of the differences between them. Their past. The secrets they kept hidden. One day. While they were walking through the estate's large garden. Eduardo realized he could no longer hide his feelings. That he noticed how relaxed Helena seemed in that space. As if her presence brightened the darkest corners of the house and his life, but Eduardo also knew that winning her over wouldn't be easy. That he spent his days trying to become closer to her in small ways. Small gestures were his attempt to show his feelings. Feelings. A cup of coffee was put on Helena's desk before she asked a seemingly casual question about something she enjoyed. Even a shy smile when their eyes met. Helena. These moments were hard to ignore. While her reason told her to be cautious, her heart seemed to want to take a different path. One morning. Eduardo in small ways. She saw a different side of him. A side that was not in her memory. Still. She remembered the differences between them. The past that separated them. The secrets that remained undisclosed. One day. While they were walking through the big garden of the estate. Eduardo realized he could not find her in the living room. Absorbed in an old photo album she had discovered on one of the shelves. She was carefully flipping through the pages. Her eyes glistening as if the images had transported her to a distant time. Without really knowing why. Eduardo sat down beside her. He said nothing. Simply watching as she delved into her memories. Helena noticed his presence. She didn't pull away. She felt comfortable with him there. Without pressure or questions that in that moment. They had an unspoken understanding. They were becoming part of each other's lives. In small ways. He was showing a side that was different from the image she had of him. Even so. She constantly reminded herself of the differences between them. The past that separated them. The secrets that remained undisclosed. One day. While they were walking through the big garden of the estate. Eduardo realized he could no longer in small ways. He showed a side that was different from the image she had of him. Even so. She constantly reminded herself of the differences between them. The past that separated them. The secrets that remained undisclosed. One day. While they were walking through the big garden of the estate. Eduardo realized he could no longer question the choices he had once made without hesitation. Helena saw this. No matter how much she tried to resist, her heart began to believe that maybe he could become the man she could love. Yet, the shadows of the past wouldn't leave them in peace. One day, while organizing some documents in the library, Helena came across a folder containing information about an old project from her family's company. Curious, she began to read. What she discovered left her unsettled. The project was directly tied to one of the greatest financial struggles her family had faced years ago. While the decisions in small ways, she saw a side of him that was different from the image she had of him. She thought about the differences between them. The past that separated them. The secrets that remained undisclosed. One day, while they were walking through the big garden of the estate, Eduardo realized he could not. It was clear he hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions at the time. She spent the rest of the day in turmoil. On one hand, she wanted to confront him and demand explanations. On the other hand, she knew Eduardo wasn't the same man who had made those decisions. He had changed. She was scared of her family. Eduardo realized that he had strong feelings for Helena. He thought about her all the time. Even when she wasn't around. He thought about losing her. Not being able to show how much he was willing to fight for her. In small ways, she saw a side of him that was different from the image she had of him. She knew there were differences between them. The past that separated them. Secrets that remained undisclosed. One day, while they were walking through the big garden of the estate, Eduardo realized he could not. Her terrified him. He knew he needed to face his own mistakes before he could ask for her trust. That evening, fate brought them face to face once again. Helena was in the kitchen, preparing tea. When Eduardo walked in, he noticed the tension in her shoulders and the distant look in her eyes. He immediately knew something. In small ways, she showed a side that was different from the image she had of him. Even so, she constantly reminded herself of the differences between them. The past that separated them. The secrets that remained undisclosed. One day, while they were walking through the big garden of the estate, Eduardo realized he could no longer. Was wrong. Without thinking, he stepped closer and called her name softly. Helena turned to face him, holding her cup as if it were a shield. She hesitated. Finally decided she had to speak. Even though her heart was torn. She knew they couldn't build something real if the secrets between them remained. She began to speak. Her voice was shaking. Steady. Eduardo listened closely. Every word was painful. When she finished, the silence that followed felt heavy. Not hopeless. Eduardo took a deep breath. Feeling guilty for something he hadn't understood at the time. He looked at Helena. Realizing that this was the most important moment of his life. Everything depended on how he responded. The words he chose now could determine whether they had a future together or if this would be the end. In that moment, Eduardo understood that no matter how difficult it might be, he was willing to do anything to earn Helena's forgiveness and love. To him, she wasn't just the woman who had changed his days, she was the woman who had changed who he was. Later that night, after Helena's confession, Eduardo found himself lost in a sea of thoughts. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at the kitchen floor as his mind tried to process everything. Meanwhile, Helena. She wasn't just the woman who had changed his days, she was the woman who had changed who he was. Later that night, After Helena's confession, Eduardo found himself lost in a sea of thoughts. He stood in silence for a long time, staring at the kitchen floor as his mind tried to process everything. Meanwhile, Helena watched him with a mix of anxiety and expectation. She didn't know whether to expect an apology, an explanation, something completely unexpected. Deep down, all she wanted was honesty. When Eduardo finally lifted his eyes, what Helena saw surprised her: genuine remorse. He wasn't a man trying to evade his guilt or shift responsibility. She felt anxious and excited as she watched him. She wasn't sure what he would do. Maybe he would apologize, explain something, do something surprising. Deep down, she wanted him to be honest with her. When Eduardo finally looked up, Helena was surprised. He looked sad and felt bad about the things he had done in the past. He was dealing with the results of his actions. He shook his head as if he was talking to himself. Then he took a deep breath. He didn't say anything. He left the kitchen. Helena was left alone. She waited for a moment, not knowing if she should follow him or give him space. In the end, she decided to let him be. In the weeks that followed, Eduardo changed his routine. He didn't go to social events anymore. He spent more time looking at old company records. Helena often saw him in the library, looking over documents with a serious face. Seemed like a man who was determined to fix the problems of his past. On the other hand, Helena tried to keep her own life in order. She couldn't stop thinking about Eduardo. Despite everything, there was something about him that attracted her. Something that made her believe he might be different from the man who had caused her family so much pain. Trusting Eduardo was dangerous. Helena knew it. One afternoon, while working in the garden, Helena heard footsteps coming. Eduardo appeared, his face showing fatigue. His eyes showed a determination Helena had never seen before. He was new to her. He held a folder in his hands and looked hesitant, as if what he carried was very important. Without saying anything, Eduardo gave her the folder. Inside were documents detailing how his company had caused her family's business to fail. Eduardo had added notes and ideas by hand about how he could fix the problem, including ideas to help rebuild what had been lost. Helena read without saying anything. Eduardo didn't interrupt, giving her time to think. When she finally looked up, her eyes showed a mix of emotions: surprise, disbelief, something like gratitude. Eduardo, in turn, he looked a little nervous. He had taken a big risk in showing her the documents. He knew it was the only way to rebuild trust between them. He didn't say he was sorry. He did things that showed he was different. In the days that followed, a small change began to take shape. Helena noticed that Eduardo was serious about changing. He started helping more with charity projects and made decisions that showed he was more aware of his responsibilities. It was as if every action he took was an effort to prove he deserved a second chance. This change didn't go. Helena started to see Eduardo differently. She stopped seeing him as the man who caused pain and started seeing him as someone who wanted to make things right. The moments they spent together became happier. Conversations that had once been tense began to have humor and, sometimes, an unexpected intimacy. Evening. Eduardo was walking in the garden at night when he suddenly stopped. He seemed confused and was trying to find the right words. Helena noticed this and touched his arm gently to let him know she was there and that he could talk. Eduardo took a deep breath and then started to speak. He told her how much she had this changed his life. He admitted that before her. He had never truly understood what it meant to care deeply for someone. Now, every decision he made seemed to revolve around her. Helena listened in silence, her heart racing with every word. When Eduardo finished, she didn't know what to say. There was something in his confession that moved her deeply. She still felt doubt. In the days that followed, their relationship took an unexpected turn. Eduardo became increasingly open, sharing stories of his childhood, his fears, his insecurities. In turn, Helena. She started to share parts of her life with him that she had always kept secret. It was as though they were building a bridge, step by step, toward each other. Secrets and differences still kept them apart. Eduardo knew that to win Helena's love, he would have to show that his feelings were real and that he was ready to face everything that came with them. But fate had other plans. A new challenge was coming to test the strength of their bond. Helena and Eduardo did not know what was going to happen. Their lives were about to change in ways they could not predict. After spending time in the garden, Helena and Eduardo were still not sure about their future. They were hopeful, worried about the mistakes they had made in the past. They were also dealing with a secret that made it hard to trust each other. One morning, Helena was working on some papers in her home office when she got a call. She was worried when she saw that the number she didn't know was calling. She answered the call. A serious-sounding man said he was a lawyer. He said he was working for a company that had been competing with Helena's family's business in the past. The man explained, in a cold way, that there was proof that Eduardo had been directly involved in decisions that had led to her father's company going out of business. Helena hung up, feeling overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. Her first instinct was to confront Eduardo. Something inside her made her pause. She knew that accusing him without hearing his side of the story could destroy everything they had built so far. She decided to keep the information to herself until she found the right moment to address it. Meanwhile, Eduardo seemed unaware of the storm brewing. He continued with his reparative initiatives, demonstrating that he was serious about making things right. One day, he told Helena that he had planned a charity event to raise money for local small businesses, including some that had been affected by the things his previous administration had done. Helena was impressed. She started to have doubts after the lawyer's call. At the event, Helena watched Eduardo talk to the guests. He seemed different from the man she had met at first, more human, more friendly. Among the smiles and casual conversations, Helena noticed something that made her heart race. One of the guests was a man she recognized from old photos in her father's. The office was there. He seemed nervous and did not look her in the eye. Without thinking, Helena decided to go to him. The conversation started politely. It quickly got tense when she mentioned her family and how Eduardo's past actions affected them. The man looked away and said something about not wanting to talk about it. Office was there. He seemed nervous and did not look directly at her. Without thinking, Helena decided to approach him. The conversation started politely but quickly grew tense when she mentioned her family and how Eduardo's past actions affected them. The man looked away and muttered something about not wanting to get involved. Then he walked away. However, he said something that Helena remembered. Not everything you've heard is true. Eduardo fought against it until the very end. He was silenced, confused and intrigued. Helena began to question what she really knew. The pieces of the puzzle seemed contradictory. The office was there. He seemed nervous and did not look directly at her. Without thinking, Helena decided to go to him. The conversation started politely. Quickly grew tense when she mentioned her family and how Eduardo's past actions affected them. The man looked away and muttered something about not wanting to talk about it. Helena realized she needed to find the truth. Not just what she had heard. That night, after the event, she decided to talk to Eduardo. She found him alone in the garden, looking at the sky. He looked tired. Also calm. Helena approached slowly, her hands shaking. The office was there. He seemed nervous and did not look at her. Without thinking, Helena decided to go to him. The conversation started politely but quickly got tense when she talked about her family and how Eduardo's past actions affected them. The man looked away and muttered something about not wanting to. When Eduardo saw her, he smiled. The look in her eyes made him take a step back. Eduardo, we need to talk. This time, I want the whole truth. He nodded, seeming to understand that something important was about to be said. Helena explained the lawyer's phone call. The man at the event. The word she had the office was there. He seemed nervous and did not look at her. Without thinking, Helena decided to go to him. The conversation started politely but quickly got difficult when she talked about her family and how Eduardo's past actions affected them. The man looked away and said something about not wanting to hear. Each of her sentences felt like a hit. Eduardo did not say anything until she finished. Finally, he took a deep breath and started to speak. Eduardo said that he had made decisions that hurt Helena's family. He also explained that many of those decisions had been made because he had to. From investors and partners who didn't share his values, that he spoke of his attempts to prevent the damage. How he had been silenced and even threatened when he tried to expose the company's unethical practices. Helena listened, absorbing every word. There was pain in his voice. Also a sincerity she couldn't ignore. Eduardo's office was there. He seemed nervous and did not look Helena in the eye. Without thinking, Helena decided to go to him. The conversation started politely but quickly got difficult when she talked about her family and how Eduardo's past actions affected them. The man looked away and said something about not wanting to forgive him. He said he understood if she could never fully forgive him. That he was willing to spend the rest of his life showing that he was a changed man. Helena did not respond right away. Her mind raced as she tried to understand the man in front of her and his dark past. She knew it would not be easy. The office was there. He seemed nervous and did not look her in the eye. Without thinking, Helena decided to go to him. The conversation started politely. It quickly got tense when she talked about her family and how Eduardo's past actions affected them. The man looked away and said something about not wanting to trust him again. Helena also knew that Eduardo had done more than just say things. He had also done things that showed his true feelings. The days that followed were filled with quiet between them. Even though they were not talking, Helena started to think about what was really important. The truth was that Eduardo, even though he had made mistakes, was trying to become a better person. This made her want to face her fears and unknowns. When she spoke to him again, she was ready. If they wanted to build something real, it would take more than forgiveness. They would have to rebuild everything, brick by brick. Over time. This would require patience. Most importantly, honesty. Helena looked at Eduardo, who seemed ready to accept whatever decision she made. In a firm tone, she said, "I can't promise it will be easy. Eduardo, I'm willing to try." From that point forward, Their journey wasn't just about fixing the past. About creating a future that, though uncertain, promised to be built on. Helena looked at Eduardo, who seemed ready to accept whatever decision she made. In a firm tone, she said, "I can't promise it will be easy, Eduardo. I'm willing to try." From that point forward, their journey wasn't just about fixing the past. About creating a future that, though uncertain, promised to be built on a new foundation, truth. The months that followed were a true test of patience, strength, love. Helena and Eduardo faced every obstacle they encountered on their way, determined to rebuild the trust between them. They set aside their masks and embraced vulnerability. Helena decided to join Eduardo in his initiatives, closely observing every step he took to right the wrongs of his company. She also began contributing her own ideas, helping him design projects aimed at supporting small communities. A reflection of her family's legacy. What started as a professional partnership grew into something Helena had never imagined, a bond that transcended. A heartfelt gesture. One bright morning, Eduardo took Helena to visit the old site where her family's business used to be. To her surprise, he had started a project to revitalize the area and turn it into a community center for young entrepreneurs. During the visit, he stopped in front of a large plaque covered by a cloth. He held her hand and said, "This place is more than a reminder of what was lost. It's the foundation of what we can build together." He pulled away the cloth that was covering the plaque, which read, "Helena Vasconcelos Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation." Helena's eyes filled with tears. This was more than an act of restitution. It was a tribute to her past and the future they were beginning to shape together. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type chocolate in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now, let's continue with the story. That night, while walking in the garden, Eduardo seemed more restless than usual. He led Helena to the bench where they often sat to gaze at the stars. Suddenly, he knelt before her, holding a small velvet box. "Helena," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "you have changed my life in every possible way. You've taught me what true love is, what forgiveness means, the strength it takes to start over. I know I'm not perfect. I'm ready to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserve. Will you marry me?" Helena felt her heart race. A moment. Everything around her disappeared. Tears streamed down her face. As she smiled and nodded her head yes, he held her hand. "You taught me that our roots can never be erased. This place reminds us of what was lost. But it's also the foundation of what we can build together." He pulled the cloth away, revealing the inscription. Helena Vasconcelos Center for. Down her face as she smiled and nodded. "Yes, Eduardo. I will." After she accepted with her heart, they shared kisses full of affection and meaning. Like a couple promising to spend their lives together. Despite all the challenges they had faced, the days that followed were a mix of joy and preparation. The wedding was set for a few months later. Both were determined to make their wedding an event that reflected their journey. Simple, sincere, full of meaning. On their wedding day, Helena wore a delicate white dress with hand embroidery that had once belonged to her mother. Eduardo wore a gray suit and looked serene. His eyes sparkled as he watched her walk toward him. The ceremony took place outdoors in the garden, where they had experienced the most challenging and transformative moments of their lives, surrounded by friends and family. They exchanged vows that moved everyone to tears during the reception. Helena pulled Eduardo aside and embraced him tightly. There was something. He held her hand. You taught me that our roots can never be erased. This place reminds us of what we've lost. It's also the foundation of what we can build together. He pulled away the cloth that covered something, revealing an inscription that read, Helena Vasconcelos Center 4. You're different in your expression. Eduardo. I have something to tell you. I need to tell you something. I went to the doctor yesterday because I had been feeling a little off. I found out we were expecting a baby. For a moment, Eduardo was speechless. Then he pulled her into a tight embrace. Laughing, he held her hand. You taught me that our roots can never be erased. This place reminds us of what we've lost. It's also where we can build something new together. He pulled away the cloth that covered the inscription. Helena Vasconcelos Center 4. He was crying. You just made me the happiest man in the world. His voice was full of emotion. The months that followed were filled with joy and growth. The pregnancy brought new challenges. It also strengthened their bond. Eduardo was devoted to Helena. She was excited to become a mother when the baby finally arrived, bringing the promise of a future filled with love and hope. Eduardo held the tiny child in his arms and looked at Helena with tears in his eyes. That he's the beginning of everything we've dreamed of, Helena. Our chance to write a new story. With the love they had built from the ashes of the past, Helena and Eduardo began the most important chapter of their lives. A family united by choices. Redemption. A love that, against all odds, had prevailed. What do you think of Eduardo's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications for new stories. Click here to read more heartwarming tales.